Hey everybody, and thanks for clicking on this video and checking out my channel. Well, we're another week closer to Christmas, which means it's time to talk about another one of my favorite Christmas movies. And this week we're talking about one that's a little bit more controversial than the previous movies in this series thus far. Dr. Seuss's How the Grinch Stole Christmas. If you'd like to sit back, relax, enjoy a nice hot cup of cocoa, and talk about this movie with me, I welcome you to do so, and I'd love for you to do so. I know there's a lot of thoughts and opinions on this one out there, so I want to hear from you. Put your thoughts and opinions about How the Grinch Stole Christmas down in the comment section below, and let's get a fun conversation going. And with all that out of the way, let's start talking about Dr. Seuss's How the Grinch Stole Christmas. So How the Grinch Stole Christmas was released in 2000. It was adapted to a screenplay by Jeffrey Price, directed by Ron Howard, and stars Jim Carrey as a disgruntled old Grinch, who, unlike his neighbors of Whoville, despises the season of Christmas. Tired of Whoville's Christmas cheer, the Grinch devises a plan to steal the residents of Whoville's presents and, in turn, their Christmas. I grew up loving this movie. My family watched it and continues to watch it to this day every single Christmas. I love Jim Carrey. I'm a huge Jim Carrey fan, and I always thought that his work in this movie was completely underrated. I love Jim Carrey in the role of the Grinch. But what I was interested to find out as I got older and got onto the internet is that this movie is not as a beloved Christmas classic as it is for my family. A lot of people out there do indeed like this movie, but it's also surprising how polarizing this movie seems to be in a lot of older people's eyes. As a kid growing up watching this movie, I have a lot of nostalgia attached to it, and my love of Jim Carrey doesn't help with that very much. So I decided this year to sit back and watch The Grinch with a more critical eye, see if there's things that don't really work as well for me as an adult. I tried to watch this really fresh. Let's get right into it. Starting off right off the bat, let's go back and talk about Jim Carrey in the role of the Grinch, because I really mean it when I say I think his performance is completely underrated in this movie. The makeup that this movie does for the Grinch is astonishing in my eyes. It completely transforms Jim Carrey into the Grinch. I never ever see Jim Carrey in this movie when I watch it. I only see the Grinch, and I think he completely disappears into the role, and the makeup done by the artist in this movie definitely helps Jim Carrey with that. They actually won an Oscar for the makeup in this movie. I didn't know that. But even with all this makeup, Jim Carrey is able to break through with his elastic face and give a very energetic and somewhat overacted performance that we're so used to seeing from Jim Carrey. And I gotta give Jim Carrey a lot of respect for the work that he does in this movie, because when you hear what he goes through with this makeup, he did the makeup for this movie like 100 times, and just the sheer torture that he seemed to go through with this makeup, I mean, you gotta give the guy a lot of respect for committing to the role the way that he does in this movie.
Literally, the makeup was like being buried alive every day. The first day was 8.5 hours. Green yak hair that turned inward and went, it was horrifying.
And The Grinch is very much the Jim Carrey show. For more than half the running time, Jim Carrey gets to just have the lens on him, and he eats it up as the Grinch. But I think because Jim Carrey is so known for his overacting and his over-energetic performances that it kind of gets lost in this movie just how much he is adding to the Grinch character through his performance in this movie. Up until this point, the only media that had the Grinch in it was the original storybook by Dr. Seuss and the original short that aired on TV. Obviously, those are the medias that made the Grinch so popular in the first place, but he doesn't have much substance to him. He's a grouch, he doesn't like Christmas, and he doesn't like the Who's. He tries to steal it from them, and then the Who's show him what Christmas is really about. It's not about presents, and then he kind of joins the Christmas spirit. That's kind of the Grinch in what we've known him up until this point. Jim Carrey really takes the Grinch and he starts to make him more of a fleshed out character in my eyes. He gives the Grinch an eccentric nature, he shows us his insecurities, we get to see him in his loneliness, we get to see him be a little bit more vulnerable, we get to know the Grinch a little bit more in this movie through Jim Carrey's performance, and Jim Carrey brings so many different dynamics to the Grinch. When he needs to be creepy, it works. When he needs to be sympathetic, it works. And even though you can look at this movie as Jim Carrey just monologuing, improvising, doing his Jim Carrey show, it actually really works for the character of the Grinch in this movie, because the Grinch is a hermit. The Grinch has outcasted himself from society for reasons that we'll get into a little bit later. Because of this, when Jim Carrey as the Grinch is talking to himself, trying to entertain himself, you know, it makes sense for this character who has been alone for so long that he would talk out loud to himself. He would do all these things. It's not just Jim Carrey being Jim Carrey for the sake of entertaining us. It works for the character of the Grinch and how the Grinch, as this hermit who's been outcasted from society for so long, would act while he's by himself in his cave on the top of Mount Crumpet for all these years. And as much as Jim carries this movie, no pun intended, I really also like the addition that they did with Cindy Lou Who, because in the original source material, Cindy Lou Who wasn't really much of a character. Cindy Lou Who was very much just a random girl who wakes up and catches the Grinch in his act. You didn't really know the character of Cindy Lou Who in the original source material, but this movie gives Cindy Lou Who a lot more to do, and I really like the connection that they give her to the Grinch. The relationship that this movie gives for Cindy Lou Who and the Grinch, I think, is the most brilliant idea that came out of this movie. Because the Grinch has outcast himself from Whoville, he very much does not want to be a part of his community and their love of Christmas. But by having Cindy Lou Who have a specific connection to the Grinch, and the Grinch start to have a relationship with this specific Who, it totally connects him more to the Who's of Whoville, more than the original source material and the original short does. And having Cindy Lou Who in this movie, played by Taylor Momsen, be the only person who actually believes and cares for the Grinch in this movie, it just brings a more heartwarming and touching feeling between the Grinch and the Who's than I get in the other Grinch material that we have out there. And I think Taylor Momsen as Cindy Lou Who and Jim Carrey as the Grinch work very well together. I think there's a really sweet relationship that's established throughout this movie between the two of them. Granted, I do think the movie could do a little bit more with them. I do wish that we got to see the Grinch kind of soften up a little bit more through his interactions with Cindy Lou Who. We mostly only get that when she does catch him in the act, which that's something in this movie that doesn't really translate well from the cartoon, because I mean, look at this. She would totally know that that's the Grinch. She's been hanging out with the Grinch all these days. I find it really hard to believe that she would not know that that's the Grinch. Unless Cindy Lou Who knows it's the Grinch and she's not letting him on, and she says all this sweet stuff to him in hopes that he'll change his ways and not steal all the presents. But I don't know. It's a moment in the movie where I'm always like, come on, he just showed his face. You know it's the Grinch. But besides that one thing, I think the addition and the extension of Cindy Lou and the Grinch's relationship in this movie is one of the best things that comes out of it. Now, of course, this movie is based off of the storybook and the original short, which only has the story of the Grinch hating the Who's and stealing the presents, eventually realizing what Christmas is about, and then returning the presents. And this movie can't do that because it's like an hour and a half. So, of course, the last half hour of this movie covers all that material. But before we can get to that part, Jeffrey Price and Ron Howard had to stretch out the story a little bit more to make it an hour and a half. So they had to fill the story with an hour of new information, new scenes, new developments, new characters that we have not seen before in the original source material. And this is where the movie can start to it starts to have some issues revealed. First off, let's start with the Who's in this movie, because this movie had to extend and show more of the Who's than we have seen in previous incarnations of this story. And they decided to go for the route of the Who's as being really into consumerism. The Who's in this movie really prove the Grinch's point, and I think that's the biggest problem with this movie, and that might be why people have such a problem with this movie that I didn't realize before. Because the Grinch in the original source material, he hates Christmas because he thinks it's all about the presents, but the Who's of Whoville, they don't care about the presents. They like the warmth of Christmas. They like being together, being with family, and that's something that the Grinch never got until the very end of the short, because the Who's reveal that to him. In this movie, though, the Who's kind of have to learn that too. When we first meet the Who's, they are all about the commercialism of Christmas. They're all about the presents. They're all about buying presents. They're all about the parades. They're all about the big, commercial parts of Christmas. But when the Grinch finally does steal their presents and they all realize that, oh wow, we've all been robbed, there's all this yelling going on by the mayor as he throws a tantrum and blames Cindy Lou Who because she brought the Grinch down to us and she ruined Christmas. And it's not until Cindy Lou Who's dad comes in and defends her that he starts to go, well, I don't need any of that stuff for Christmas but my family. And then all the Who's kind of realize that. So it's like in the beginning of this movie when the Grinch hates the Who's and thinks all Christmas is presents and stuff to them, he's kind of right. And it just so happens that the moral of the story that the Grinch has to learn, the Who's also have to learn, and they just happen to learn it first so that the Grinch is able to learn it. And while that doesn't ruin the movie for me, I can definitely see why people might have a problem with that in particular, because it makes the moral message of the whole story that Dr. Seuss created, it really weakens that message. And while the movie eventually does get to that message, it's definitely not done as well as in the original source material. This movie also decides to give us a backstory to the Grinch. And now, a backstory to the Grinch, I'm actually not against. I actually think hearing why he hates Christmas could be really interesting. Maybe he did feel like the busyness of Whoville was just too much for him to handle. Maybe that's why he hates the Who's and he hates Christmas. Maybe he has a point. But this movie decides to go for a backstory of the Grinch a little bit more generically.
Look at that hack job!
Yeah, he was bullied in school. The Grinch was just bullied in school, and it was around Christmas time. He wanted to give a gift to a girl, which the Grinch having a love interest, I didn't really think about it as a kid, but watching it back as an adult, it's like the one part of the movie you could probably cut out. Or, okay, one of the parts you could have cut out of the movie.
Where are you, Christmas?
I mean, it is a little weird to think of the Grinch having a love story. But anyways, they decide to do this backstory with the Grinch where he was bullied, he had a bad day at school, he was picked on by a kid who will eventually become the mayor, and because of that, he runs away. He goes to the top of Mount Crumpet and he never comes back down. And I don't know, it never bothered me as a kid. In fact, I actually kind of liked this sequence as a kid. I liked the little Grinch and seeing him as a kid and stuff, and there's some good comedy that comes out of it when he's a baby. But just looking back at it with adult eyes, it's a little uninspired. It just doesn't feel that creative. And I'm not saying that I could do it any better. I'm just thinking when you have this place of Whoville, when you have this kind of fantasy land with the Grinch, and you have all this freedom to tell why the Grinch doesn't like Christmas, being bullied in school just seems like low-hanging fruit. But wow, that narrator was sure off with his guesses, wasn't he?
It could be that his head wasn't screwed on just right. Or it could be, perhaps, that his shoes were too tight. But I think that the most likely reason of all
was that the Grinch was bullied in school severely when he was still very small. And if I'm going to go into more technical sides of the movie, I do think that the cinematography is not that great. Well, it's just the way the movie looks. The movie doesn't look all that appealing. Whoville doesn't look all that whimsical. The movie doesn't look all that bright and colorful. I mean, maybe that was on purpose. It looks kind of washed out, and maybe that's to make the Grinch, who's this green guy, stand out more. I don't know what the intention behind that is. Looking at this movie as an adult, it's not that pleasant of a movie to look at. But even with all those changes made that I look at with more of a critical eye nowadays and seeing the issues that can come out of them, I do find a lot of enjoyment in The Grinch. And when we finally do get to the part of the story that this movie is totally based on, the Grinch going down and stealing Christmas from the Who's, I think they do a really good job of making the storybook and the original TV short feel like it's come to life on the big screen. Having Jim Carrey sing "You're a Mean One, Mr. Grinch" I think works really well for this movie because, as established before, the Grinch constantly talks to himself, he monologues to himself, so the fact that he would sing a song about himself as he's devising his plan, I really don't think is that much of a stretch, and it's a really smart way to incorporate the song into the movie. I like the changes made that they do with the sled and making it fly with rockets and stuff. I think that's just a little bit more believable than the dog Max having him pull down the mountain. Granted, they do make the dog Max pull him back up the mountain, but I don't know, that's a nitpick. I like the rocket sled. When he does get to Whoville and he starts stealing all the presents, I think it's a really fun sequence and really does feel like the storybook come to life. And I like the new take and the new additions to it. I like that he has this vacuum that he puts down the chimney and just sucks up all the presents. I think that was really smart. I just like the new inventive things that they add to the story of how the Grinch does steal Christmas, putting their own little new flair on it. And I just have a lot of fun with that sequence of the movie. And in the end, guys, yeah, I looked at the Grinch a little bit differently this year. I watched it with a more critical eye. There are issues and problems that stand out to it more to me now that I'm an adult, but I still really find a lot of enjoyment in this movie. I think Jim Carrey is great. I like the relationship between him and Cindy Lou Who. I think a lot of the comedy hits, a lot of it coming from Carrey himself through his monologuing. And when you finally get to the original source material, I do think that it's really fun to see it come into live action and watch the Grinch steal Christmas from the Who's. And while the message may not hit as strongly as the original source material, I do think the message is still there. And by the time that the Grinch is singing around the Christmas tree with all the other Who's, I do feel the warmth of Christmas come over me. Call it nostalgia, call it my love for Jim Carrey, but I really do think Dr. Seuss's How the Grinch Stole Christmas is not as bad as a lot of people out there seem to think it is. But as I said before, that's just my opinion, and I did grow up with the movie. I want to hear from you guys, though. What do you guys think of Ron Howard's directed Dr. Seuss's How the Grinch Stole Christmas with Jim Carrey? Comment down below, let me know. I want to know all your thoughts and opinions about this movie, especially if you didn't grow up with it. And with that down, guys, that's another week done of one of my favorite Christmas movies. Thank you so much for joining me for another Christmas movie review. I'll be back next week before Christmas to talk about another one of my favorite Christmas movies. I can't wait to see you guys then. Until next time, my name's Zachary Milne. Thank you for talking movies with me. Have a Merry Christmas and a great day.